Otto von Bismarck.
Otto Eduard Leopold, Prince of Bismarck, Duke of Lauenburg, known as Otto von Bismarck, was a conservative Prussian statesman who dominated German and European affairs from the 1860s until 1890. In the 1860s he engineered a series of wars that unified the German states into a powerful German empire under Prussian leadership. With that accomplished by 1871 he skillfully used balance of power diplomacy to preserve German hegemony in a Europe which, despite many disputes and war scares, remained at peace. For historian Eric Hobsbawm, Bismarck remained undisputed world champion at the game of multilateral diplomatic chess for almost 20 years after 1871, devoted himself exclusively, and successfully, to maintaining peace between the powers. Upon his 1862 appointment by King Wilhelm I as Minister-President of Prussia, Bismarck provoked 3 short, decisive wars against Denmark, Austria and France, and aligned the smaller German states behind Prussia in defeating his arch-enemy France. In 1871 he formed the German Empire with himself as Chancellor, while retaining control of Prussia. His diplomacy of realpolitik and powerful rule at home gained him the nickname the Iron Chancellor. German unification and its rapid economic growth was the foundation to his foreign policy. He disliked colonialism but reluctantly built an overseas empire when it was demanded by both elite and mass opinion. Juggling a very complex interlocking series of conferences, negotiations and alliances, he used his unrivaled diplomatic skills to maintain Germany's position and use the balance of power to keep Europe at peace in the 1870s and 1880s. He was the master of complex politics at home. He created the first welfare state in the modern world, with the goal of gaining working-class support that might otherwise go to his socialist enemies. In the 1870s he allied himself with the liberals, who were low-tariff and anti-Catholic, and fought the Catholic Church in a culture war. He lost that battle as the Catholics responded by forming a powerful centre party and using universal male suffrage to gain a block of seats. Bismarck then reversed himself, ended the culture war, broke with the liberals, imposed tariffs, and formed a political alliance with the Centre Party to fight the socialists. A devout Lutheran, he was loyal to his king, who in turn gave Bismarck his full support, against the advice of his wife and his heir. While Germany's parliament was elected by universal male suffrage, it did not have real control of the government. Bismarck distrusted democracy and ruled through a strong, well-trained bureaucracy with power in the hands of a traditional Junker elite that comprised the landed nobility of the East. Bismarck largely controlled domestic and foreign affairs under the elderly Wilhelm I until he was removed by young Kaiser Wilhelm II in 1890. Bismarck, an aristocratic Junker himself, had an extremely aggressive and domineering personality. He displayed a violent temper and kept his power by threatening to resign time and again. He possessed not only a long-term national and international vision, but also the short-term ability to juggle many complex developments simultaneously. As the leader of what historians call revolutionary conservatism, Bismarck became a hero to German nationalists. They built hundreds of monuments glorifying the iconic symbol of powerful conservative leadership. Historians generally praise him as a statesman of moderation and balance who kept the peace in Europe, and was primarily responsible for the unification of Germany and building its world-renowned bureaucracy and army.
Early years.
Bismarck was born in Schönhausen, a wealthy family estate situated west of Berlin in the Prussian province of Saxony. His father, Karl Wilhelm Ferdinand von Bismarck, 1771–1845, was a Junker estate owner and a former Prussian military officer. His mother, Wilhelmine Luz Mencken, 1789–1839, the well-educated daughter of a senior government official in Berlin. The world saw Bismarck as a typical Prussian Junker, an image which he encouraged by wearing military uniforms. Bismarck was well-educated and cosmopolitan, with a gift for conversation. He was fluent in English, French, Italian, Polish and Russian. Bismarck was educated at Johann Ernst Plemann's Elementary School, and the Friedrich Wilhelm and Großkloster secondary schools. From 1832 to 1833 he studied law at the University of Göttingen, where he was a member of the Corps Hannover, and then enrolled at the University of Berlin, 1833-35. At Göttingen, Bismarck became friends with the American student John Lothrop Motley. Motley, who later became an eminent historian and diplomat while remaining close to Bismarck, wrote a novel in 1839, Morton's Hope, or The Memoirs of a Provincial, about life in a German university. In it he described Bismarck as a reckless and dashing eccentric, but also as an extremely gifted and charming young man. Although Bismarck hoped to become a diplomat, he started his practical training as a lawyer in Aachen and Potsdam, and soon resigned, having first placed his career in jeopardy by taking unauthorized leave to pursue two English girls, first Laura Russell, niece of the Duke of Cleveland, and then Isabella Lorraine Smith, daughter of a wealthy clergyman. He also served in the army for a year and became an officer in the Landwehr Reserve, before returning to run the family estates at Schönhausen on his mother's death in his mid-20s. Around age 30 Bismarck had an intense friendship with Marie von Naden, newly married to one of his friends. Under her influence, Bismarck became a Pietist Lutheran, and later recorded that at Marie's deathbed, from typhoid, he prayed for the first time since his childhood. Bismarck married Marie's cousin, the noblewoman Johanna von Puttkamer, 1824-94, at Altkulziglo, modern Kolchigloe, on July 28, 1847. Their long and happy marriage produced 3 children, Herbert, b. 1849, Wilhelm, b. 1852, and Marie, b. 1847. Johanna was a shy, retiring and deeply religious woman, although famed for her sharp tongue in later life, and in his public life Bismarck was sometimes accompanied by his sister Malwine Moore von Arnim.
Early political career.
In 1847 Bismarck, aged 32, was chosen as a representative to the newly created Prussian legislature, the Vereinigte Landtag. There, he gained a reputation as a royalist and reactionary politician with a gift for stinging rhetoric. He openly advocated the idea that the monarch had a divine right to rule. His selection was arranged by the Gerlach brothers, fellow Pietist Lutherans whose ultra-conservative faction was known as the Kreuzeitung after their newspaper, the Neue-Preußische Zeitung, which was so nicknamed because it featured an iron cross on its cover. In March 1848, Prussia faced a revolution, one of the revolutions of 1848 across Europe, which completely overwhelmed King Friedrich Wilhelm IV. The monarch, though initially inclined to use armed forces to suppress the rebellion, ultimately declined to leave Berlin for the safety of military headquarters at Potsdam. Bismarck later recorded that there had been a rattling of sabers in their scabbards from Prussian officers when they learned that the king would not suppress the revolution by force. He offered numerous concessions to the liberals. He wore the black, red and gold revolutionary colors, as seen on the flag of today's Germany, promised to promulgate a constitution, agreed that Prussia and other German states should merge into a single nation-state, and appointed a liberal, Ludolf Camphausen, as minister-president. Bismarck had at first tried to rouse the peasants of his estate into an army to march on Berlin in the king's name. He traveled to Berlin in disguise to offer his services, but was instead told to make himself useful by arranging food supplies for the army from his estates in case they were needed. The king's brother Prince Wilhelm had fled to England, and Bismarck intrigued with Wilhelm's wife Augusta to place their teenage son Friedrich on the Prussian throne in Friedrich Wilhelm IV's place. Augusta would have none of it, and detested Bismarck thereafter, despite the fact that he later helped restore a working relationship between the king and his brother. Bismarck was not yet a member of the Landtag, the lower house of the new Prussian legislature. The liberal victory perished by the end of 1848. The movement became weak due to internal fighting, while the conservatives regrouped, formed an inner group of advisers, including the Gerlach brothers, known as the Camarilla around the king, and retook control of Berlin. Although a constitution was granted, its provisions fell far short of the demands of the revolutionaries. In 1849, Bismarck was elected to the Landtag. At this stage in his career, he opposed the unification of Germany, arguing that Prussia would lose its independence in the process. He accepted his appointment as one of Prussia's representatives at the Erfurt Parliament, an assembly of German states that met to discuss plans for union, but he only did so to oppose that body's proposals more effectively. The parliament failed to bring about unification, for it lacked the support of the two most important German states, Prussia and Austria. In September 1850, after a dispute over Hesse, the Hesse Crisis of 1850, Prussia was humiliated and forced to back down by Austria, supported by Russia, in the so-called Punctation of Olmütz. A plan for the unification of Germany under Prussian leadership, proposed by Prussia's Minister-President Radowitz, was also abandoned. In 1851, Friedrich Wilhelm IV appointed Bismarck as Prussia's envoy to the Diet of the German Confederation in Frankfurt. Bismarck gave up his elected seat in the Landtag, but was appointed to the Prussian House of Lords a few years later. In Frankfurt he engaged in a battle of wills with the Austrian representative Count Friedrich von Thun und Hohenstein, insisting on being treated as an equal by petty tactics such as insisting on doing the same when Thun claimed the privileges of smoking and removing his jacket in meetings. This episode was the background for an altercation in the Frankfurt chamber with Georg von Vinck that led to a duel between Bismarck and Vinck and Karl von Bodelschwinger's impartial party, which ended without injury. Bismarck's 8 years in Frankfurt were marked by changes in his political opinions, detailed in the numerous lengthy memoranda which he sent to his ministerial superiors in Berlin. No longer under the influence of his ultra-conservative Prussian friends, Bismarck became less reactionary and more pragmatic. He became convinced that to countervail Austria's newly restored influence, Prussia would have to ally herself with other German states. As a result, he grew to be more accepting of the notion of a united German nation. Bismarck also worked to maintain the friendship of Russia and a working relationship with Napoleon III's France, the latter being anathema to his conservative friends the Guelphs, but necessary both to threaten Austria and to prevent France allying herself to Russia. In a famous letter to Leopold von Gullasch, Bismarck wrote that it was foolish to play chess having first put 16 of the 64 squares out of bounds. This observation was ironic as after 1871, France indeed became Germany's permanent enemy, and eventually allied with Russia against Germany in the 1890s. Bismarck was also horrified by Prussia's isolation during the Crimean War of the mid-1850s, in which Austria sided with Britain and France against Russia. Prussia was almost not invited to the peace talks in Paris. In the Eastern crisis of the 1870s, fear of a repetition of this turn of events would later be a factor in Bismarck's signing the dual alliance with Austria-Hungary in 1879. However, in the 1850s Bismarck correctly foresaw that by failing to support Russia, after Russian help in crashing the Hungarian revolt in 1849, and at Olmütz in 1850, the Austrian leader Schwarzenberg had said, Austria would astonish the world by the depth of her ingratitude. Austria could no longer count on her support in Italy and Germany, and had thus exposed herself to attack by France and Prussia.
Ambassador to Russia and France.
In October 1857, Friedrich Wilhelm IV suffered a paralyzing stroke. His brother Wilhelm took over the Prussian government as regent. Wilhelm was initially seen as a moderate ruler, whose friendship with liberal Britain was symbolized by the recent marriage of his son Friedrich to Queen Victoria's eldest daughter. As part of Wilhelm's new course he brought in new ministers, moderate conservatives known as the Wachenblatt Party after their newspaper. Soon the regent replaced Bismarck as envoy in Frankfurt and made him Prussia's ambassador to the Russian Empire. In theory this was a promotion as Russia was one of Prussia's two most powerful neighbors. But Bismarck was sidelined from events in Germany, watching impotently as France drove Austria out of Lombardy during the Italian War of 1859. Bismarck proposed that Prussia should exploit Austria's weakness to move her frontiers as far south as Lake Constance on the Swiss border. Instead Prussia mobilized troops in the Rhineland to deter further French advances into Venetia. As a further snub, the regent, who scorned Bismarck as a Landwehrleutnant, reserve lieutenant, had declined to promote him to the rank of Major General, normal for the ambassador to St. Petersburg, and important as Prussia and Russia were close military allies. whose heads of state often communicated through military contacts rather than diplomatic channels. Bismarck stayed in St. Petersburg for 4 years, during which he almost lost his leg to botched medical treatment and once again met his future adversary, the Russian Prince Gorchakov, who had been the Russian representative in Frankfurt in the early 1850s. The regent also appointed Helmut von Moltke as the new chief of staff of the Prussian army, and Albrecht von Roon as Minister of War with the job of reorganizing the army. Over the next 12 years these two and Bismarck transformed Prussia. Bismarck later referred to this period as the most significant of my life. Despite his lengthy stay abroad, Bismarck was not entirely detached from German domestic affairs. He remained well informed due to his friendship with Roon, and they formed a lasting political alliance. In May 1862, he was sent to Paris, to serve as ambassador to France. He also visited England that summer. These visits enabled him to meet and take the measure of several adversaries, Napoleon III in France, and in Britain, Prime Minister Palmerston, Foreign Secretary Earl Russell, and conservative politician Benjamin Disraeli. Disraeli, who would become Prime Minister in the 1870s, later claimed to have said of Bismarck, "Be careful of that man, he means every word he says."
Minister-President of Prussia.
The regent became King Wilhelm I upon his brother's death in 1861. The new monarch often came into conflict with the increasingly liberal Prussian Diet. A crisis arose in 1862, when the Diet refused to authorize funding for a proposed reorganization of the army. The king's ministers could not convince legislators to pass the budget, and the king was unwilling to make concessions. Wilhelm threatened to abdicate, though his son Friedrich opposed his abdication, and believed that Bismarck was the only politician capable of handling the crisis. However, Wilhelm was ambivalent about appointing a person who demanded unfettered control over foreign affairs. When, in September 1862, the Abgeordnetenhaus, House of Deputies, overwhelmingly rejected the proposed budget, Wilhelm was persuaded to recall Bismarck to Prussia on the advice of Roon. On September 23, 1862, Wilhelm appointed Bismarck Minister-President and Foreign Minister. Bismarck, Roon and Moltke took charge at a time when relations among the great powers, Great Britain, France, Austria and Russia, had been shattered by the Crimean War and the Italian War. In the midst of this disarray, the European balance of power was restructured with the creation of the German Empire as the dominant power in Europe. This was achieved by Bismarck's diplomacy, Roon's reorganization of the army, and Moltke's military strategy. Despite the initial distrust of the king and crown prince, and the loathing of Queen Augusta, Bismarck soon acquired a powerful hold over the king by force of personality and powers of persuasion. Bismarck was intent on maintaining royal supremacy by ending the budget deadlock in the king's favor, even if he had to use extra-legal means to do so. He contended that, since the Constitution did not provide for cases in which legislators failed to approve a budget, he could merely apply the previous year's budget. Thus, on the basis of the 1861 budget, tax collection continued for 4 years. Bismarck's conflict with the legislators intensified in the coming years. Following the Alvensleben Convention of 1863, the House of Deputies resolved that it could no longer come to terms with Bismarck. In response, the king dissolved the Diet, accusing it of trying to obtain unconstitutional control over the ministry. Bismarck then issued an edict restricting the freedom of the press. This policy even gained the public opposition of Crown Prince Friedrich. Despite attempts to silence critics, Bismarck remained a largely unpopular politician. His supporters fared poorly in the elections of October 1863, in which a liberal coalition, whose primary member was the Progress Party, won over 2/3 of the seats. The House made repeated calls for Bismarck to be dismissed, but the king supported him as he feared that if he did dismiss the minister-president, a liberal ministry would follow.
German unification. Blood and Iron speech.
German unification had been a major objective of the revolutions of 1848, when representatives of the German states met in Frankfurt and drafted a constitution creating a federal union with a national parliament to be elected by universal male suffrage. In April 1849, the Frankfurt Parliament offered the title of Emperor to King Friedrich Wilhelm IV. Fearing the opposition of the other German princes and the military intervention of Austria and Russia, the king refused this popular mandate. Thus, the Frankfurt Parliament ended in failure for the German liberals. On September 30, 1862, Bismarck made a speech to the Budget Committee of the Prussian Chamber of Deputies, in which he expanded on the use of iron and blood to achieve Prussia's goals.
Defeat of Denmark.
Germany, prior to the 1860s, consisted of a multitude of principalities loosely bound together as members of the German Confederation. Bismarck used both diplomacy and the Prussian military to achieve unification, excluding Austria from a unified Germany. Not only did this make Prussia the most powerful and dominant component of the new Germany, but also ensured that it remained authoritarian, rather than a liberal parliamentary regime. Bismarck faced a diplomatic crisis when Frederick VII of Denmark died in November 1863. Succession to the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein were disputed. They were claimed by Christian IX, Frederick VII's heir as king, and by Frederick von Augustenberg, a German duke. Prussian public opinion strongly favored Augustenberg's claim, as Holstein and southern Schleswig were and still are mostly German-speaking. Bismarck took an unpopular step by insisting that the territories legally belonged to the Danish monarch under the London Protocol signed a decade earlier. Nonetheless, Bismarck denounced Christian's decision to completely annex Schleswig to Denmark. With support from Austria, he issued an ultimatum for Christian IX to return Schleswig to its former status. When Denmark refused, Austria and Prussia invaded, commencing the Second Schleswig War, and Denmark was forced to cede both duchies. At first this seemed like a victory for Frederick of Augustenberg, but Bismarck soon removed him from power by making a series of unworkable demands, namely that Prussia should have control over the army and navy of the duchies. Originally, it was proposed that the Diet of the German Confederation, in which all the states of Germany were represented, should determine the fate of the duchies. But before this scheme could be effected, Bismarck induced Austria to agree to the Gastein Convention. Under this agreement signed August 20, 1865, Prussia received Schleswig, while Austria received Holstein. In that year he was made Graf, Count, von Bismarck-Schönhausen.
Defeat of Austria.
In 1866, Austria reneged on the agreement and demanded that the Diet determine the Schleswig-Holstein issue. Bismarck used this as an excuse to start a war with Austria by accusing them of violating the Gastein Convention. Bismarck sent Prussian troops to occupy Holstein. Provoked, Austria called for the aid of other German states, who quickly became involved in the Austro-Prussian War. Thanks to von Roon's reorganizing, the Prussian army was nearly equal in numbers to the Austrian army. With the strategic genius of von Moltke, the Prussian army fought battles it was able to win. Bismarck had also made a secret alliance with Italy, who desired Austrian-controlled Venetia. Italy's entry into the war forced the Austrians to divide their forces. Meanwhile, as the war began, a German radical named Ferdinand Cohen-Blind attempted to assassinate Bismarck in Berlin, shooting him 5 times at close range. Bismarck had only minor injuries. Cohen-Blind committed suicide while in custody. The war lasted 7 weeks. Germans called it a blitzkrieg, lightning war, a term also used in 1939. Austria had a seemingly powerful army. It was allied with most of the North German and all of the South German states. Nevertheless, Prussia won the decisive Battle of Königgrätz. The king and his generals wanted to push onward, conquer Bohemia and march to Vienna, but Bismarck, worried that Prussian military luck might change or that France might intervene on Austria's side, enlisted the help of the Crown Prince, who had opposed the war but had commanded one of the Prussian armies at Königgrätz, to dissuade his father after stormy meetings. Bismarck insisted on a soft peace with no annexations and no victory parades, so as to be able to quickly restore friendly relations with Austria. To the surprise of the rest of Europe, Prussia quickly defeated Austria and its allies at the Battle of Königgrätz, which saw Prussia exclude Austria from Germany and allowed Prussia to dominate German politics. The king and his generals wanted to push onward, conquer Bohemia and march to Vienna, but Bismarck, worried that Prussian military luck might change or that France might intervene on Austria's side, enlisted the help of the Crown Prince, who had opposed the war but had commanded one of the Prussian armies at Königgrätz, to dissuade his father after stormy meetings. As a result of the Peace of Prague, 1866, the German Confederation was dissolved. Prussia annexed Schleswig, Holstein, Frankfurt, Hanover, Hesse-Kassel, and Nassau. Further, Austria promised not to intervene in German affairs. To solidify Prussian hegemony, Prussia and several other North German states joined the North German Confederation in 1867. King Wilhelm I served as its president, and Bismarck as its chancellor. This began what historians refer to as the misery of Austria, in which Austria served as a mere vassal to the superior Germany, a relationship that was to shape history until the two world wars. Bismarck had originally managed to convince smaller states like Saxony, Hesse-Kassel, and Hanover to join Prussia against Austria, after promising them protection from foreign invasion, morale unity, and fair commercial laws. Bismarck, who by now held the rank of major in the Landwehr, wore this uniform during the campaign, and was at last promoted to the rank of Major General in the Landwehr Cavalry after the war. Although he never personally commanded troops in the field, he usually wore a general's uniform in public for the rest of his life, as seen in numerous paintings and photographs. He was also given a cash grant by the Prussian Landtag, which he used to buy a new country estate, Varzin, larger than his existing estates combined. Military success brought Bismarck tremendous political support in Prussia. In the House of Deputies elections of 1866, Liberals suffered a major defeat, losing their large majority. The new, largely conservative House was on much better terms with Bismarck than previous bodies. At the Minister-President's request, it retroactively approved the budgets of the past 4 years, which had been implemented without parliamentary consent.
Franco-Prussian War 1870-71.
Prussia's victory over Austria increased tensions with France. Its emperor, Napoleon III, feared that a powerful Germany would change the balance of power in Europe. Opposition politician Adolf Thiers had observed, it was France, not Austria, who was really defeated at Königgrätz. Bismarck, at the same time, did not avoid war with France. He believed that if the German states perceived France as the aggressor, they would unite behind the King of Prussia. To achieve this he kept Napoleon III involved in various intrigues whereby France might gain territory from Luxembourg or Belgium. France never achieved any such gain, but it was made to look greedy and untrustworthy. A suitable premise for war arose in 1870, when the German Prince Leopold of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen was offered the Spanish throne, vacant since a revolution in 1868. France blocked the candidacy and demanded assurances that no member of the House of Hohenzollern would become King of Spain. To provoke France into declaring war with Prussia, Bismarck published the Ems Dispatch, a carefully edited version of a conversation between King Wilhelm and the French ambassador to Prussia, Count Benedetti. This conversation had been edited so that each nation felt that its ambassador had been disrespected and ridiculed, thus inflaming popular sentiment on both sides in favor of war. Langer, however, argues that this episode played a minor role in causing the war. France mobilized and declared war on July 19. The German states saw France as the aggressor. Swept up by nationalism and patriotic zeal, they rallied to Prussia's side and provided troops. Both of Bismarck's sons served as officers in the Prussian cavalry. The war was a great success for Prussia as the German army, controlled by Chief of Staff Moltke, won victory after victory. The major battles were all fought in 1 month, August 7 till September 1, and both French armies were captured at Sedan and Metz, the latter after a siege of some weeks. Napoleon III was taken prisoner at Sedan and kept in Germany for a time in case Bismarck had need of him to head the French regime. He later died in exile in England in 1873. The remainder of the war featured a siege of Paris. The city was ineffectually bombarded. The new French Republican regime then tried, without success, to relieve Paris with various hastily assembled armies and increasingly bitter partisan warfare. Bismarck acted immediately to secure the unification of Germany. He negotiated with representatives of the southern German states, offering special concessions if they agreed to unification. The negotiations succeeded. While the war was in its final phase, Wilhelm I of Prussia was proclaimed German Emperor on January 18, 1871 in the Hall of Mirrors in the Château de Versailles. The new German Empire was a federation. Each of its 25 constituent states, kingdoms, grand duchies, duchies, principalities, and free cities, retained some autonomy. The King of Prussia, as German Emperor, was not sovereign over the entirety of Germany. He was only primus inter pares, or first among equals. But he held the presidency of the Bundesrat, which met to discuss policy presented by the Chancellor, whom the President appointed. At the end, France had to surrender Alsace and part of Lorraine, because Moltke and his generals wanted it as a defensive barrier. Bismarck opposed the annexation because he did not wish to make a permanent enemy of France. France was also required to pay an indemnity. The indemnity figure was calculated, on the basis of population, as the precise equivalent of the indemnity which Napoleon I imposed on Prussia in 1807.
Chancellor of the German Empire.
In 1871, Otto von Bismarck was raised to the rank of first Prince. He was also appointed Imperial Chancellor, Reichskanzler, of the German Empire, but retained his Prussian offices, including those of Minister-President and Foreign Minister. He was also promoted to the rank of Lieutenant General, and given another country estate, Friedrichsruhe, near Hamburg, which was larger than Varzin, making him a very wealthy landowner. Because of both the imperial and the Prussian offices that he held, Bismarck had near complete control over domestic and foreign policy. The office of Minister-President of Prussia was temporarily separated from that of Chancellor in 1873, when Albrecht von Roon was appointed to the former office. But by the end of the year, Roon resigned due to ill health, and Bismarck again became MP.
Anti-Catholic Kulturkampf.
Bismarck launched an anti-Catholic Kulturkampf, culture struggle in Prussia in 1871. This was partly motivated by Bismarck's fear that Pius IX and future popes would use papal infallibility as a weapon for promoting a potential papal desire for international political hegemony. The result was the Kulturkampf, which, with its largely Prussian measures, complemented by similar actions in several other German states, sought to curb the clerical danger by legislation restricting the Catholic Church's political power. To prevent potential papal meddling, in May 1872 Bismarck attempted to reach an understanding with other European governments to manipulate future papal elections. Governments should agree beforehand on unsuitable candidates, and then instruct their national cardinals to vote appropriately. The goal was to end the Pope's control over the bishops in a given state, but the project went nowhere. Bismarck accelerated the Kulturkampf. In its course, all Prussian bishops and many priests were imprisoned or exiled. Prussia's population greatly expanded in the 1860s and now was one-third Catholic. Bismarck believed that the Pope and bishops held too much power over the German Catholics. He was further concerned about the emergence of the Catholic Centre Party, organized in 1870. With support from the anti-clerical National Liberal Party, which had become Bismarck's chief ally in the Reichstag, he abolished the Catholic department of the Prussian Ministry of Culture. That left the Catholics without a voice in high circles. In 1872, the Jesuits were expelled from Germany. More severe anti-Roman Catholic laws of 1873 allowed the Prussian government to supervise the education of the Roman Catholic clergy, and curtailed the disciplinary powers of the Church. In 1875, civil ceremonies were required for weddings, which could hitherto be performed in churches. The Catholics reacted by organizing themselves. They strengthened the Centre Party. Bismarck, a devout pietistic Protestant, was alarmed that secularists and socialists were using the Kulturkampf to attack all religion. he abandoned it in 1878 to preserve his remaining political capital. By the time, he came to need the Centre Party votes in his new battle against socialism. Pius IX died that year, replaced by the more pragmatic Pope Leo XIII, who negotiated away most of the anti-Catholic laws.
Economy.
In 1873, Germany and much of Europe and America entered the Long Depression, the Gründerkrise. A downturn hit the German economy for the first time since industrial development began to surge in the 1850s. To aid faltering industries, the Chancellor abandoned free trade and established protectionist import tariffs, which alienated the national liberals who demanded free trade. The Kulturkampf and its effects also stirred up public opinion against the party that supported it, and Bismarck used this opportunity to distance himself from the national liberals. This marked a rapid decline in the support of the national liberals, and by 1879 their close ties with Bismarck had all but ended. Bismarck instead returned to conservative factions, including the Centre Party, for support. He helped foster support from the conservatives by enacting several tariffs protecting German agriculture and industry from foreign competitors in 1879.
Germanization.
The government tried to Germanize the state's national minorities, situated mainly in the borders of the empire, such as the Danes in the north of Germany, the French of Alsace-Lorraine and the Poles in the east of Germany. He pursued an extremely hostile policy concerning the Poles, furthering enmity between the German and Polish peoples. The policies were motivated by Bismarck's view that Polish existence was a threat to the German state. Bismarck compared Polish population to animals that need to be shot and privately confessed that he would like to exterminate them.
Socialism.
Worried by the growth of the socialist movement, in particular, that of the Social Democratic Party, Bismarck instituted the anti-socialist laws in 1878. Socialist organizations and meetings were forbidden, as was the circulation of socialist literature. Police officers could stop, search, and arrest Socialist Party members. Socialist leaders were arrested and tried by police courts. But despite these efforts, the movement steadily gained supporters and seats in the Reichstag. Socialists won seats in the Reichstag by running as independent candidates, unaffiliated with any party, which was allowed by the German constitution.
Foreign policies.
Bismarck had unified his nation and now he devoted himself to promoting peace in Europe with his skills in statesmanship. He was forced to contend with French revanchism, the desire to avenge the losses of the Franco-Prussian War. Bismarck therefore engaged in a policy of diplomatically isolating France while maintaining cordial relations with other nations in Europe. He had little interest in naval or colonial entanglements and thus avoided discord with Great Britain. Historians emphasize that he wanted no more territorial gains after 1871, and vigorously worked to form cross-linking alliances that prevented any war in Europe from starting. A.J.P. Taylor, a leading British diplomatic historian, concludes that Bismarck was an honest broker of peace. And his system of alliances compelled every power, whatever its will, to follow a peaceful course. Bismarck's goal was a peaceful Europe, based on the balance of power, that would allow Germany's economy to flourish. Bismarck feared that a hostile combination of Austria, France and Russia would crush Germany. If two of them were allied, then the third would ally with Germany only if Germany conceded excessive demands. The solution was to ally with two of the three. In 1873 he formed the League of the Three Emperors, an alliance of the Kaiser of Germany, the Tsar of Russia, and the Emperor of Austria-Hungary. Together they would control Eastern Europe, making sure that restive ethnic groups such as the Poles were kept in control. The Balkans posed a more serious issue, and Bismarck's solution was to give Austria predominance in the Western Balkan areas, and Russia in the eastern areas. The system collapsed in 1887. In 1872, a protracted quarrel began to fester between Bismarck and Count Harry von Arnim, the imperial ambassador to France. Arnim saw himself as a rival and competitor for the chancellorship, but the rivalry escalated out of hand and Arnim took sensitive records from embassy files at Paris to back up his case. He was formally accused of misappropriating official documents, indicted, tried, and convicted, and fled into exile, where he died. No one again openly challenged Bismarck in foreign policy matters until his resignation.
France. War inside crisis of 1875.
Between 1873 and 1877, according to Stone, 1994, Germany repeatedly acted the bully against France by manipulating the internal affairs of France's neighbors to hurt it. Bismarck put heavy pressure on Belgium, Spain, and Italy, hoping to obtain the election of liberal, anti-clerical governments. His plan was to promote republicanism in France by isolating the clerical monarchist regime of President MacMahon. He hoped that ringing France with liberal states would help the French Republicans defeat MacMahon and his reactionary supporters. The bullying almost got out of hand with a brief and war scare in mid-1875. It was sparked by an editorial entitled Krieg und Sicht, War in Sight, in a Berlin newspaper close to the government, the Post. It indicated that highly influential Germans were alarmed by France's rapid recovery from defeat in 1875 and its announcement of an increase in the size of its army. They talked of launching a preventive war against France to hold it down. Bismarck denied knowing about the article ahead of time, but he certainly knew about the talk of preventive war. The editorial produced a war scare. Britain and Russia made it clear they would not tolerate a preventive war against France. Bismarck did not want any war either, and the crisis blew over. It was one of the rare instances when his opponents outmaneuvered and embarrassed Bismarck, but he learned an important lesson. It forced him to take into account the fear and alarm that his bullying and Germany's fast-growing power was causing among its neighbors. The crisis reinforced Bismarck's determination that Germany had to work in proactive fashion to preserve the peace in Europe, rather than passively let events take their own course and react to them.
Italy.
Bismarck maintained good relations with Italy, although he had a personal dislike for Italians and their country. He can be seen as a marginal contributor to Italian unification. Politics surrounding the 1866 war against Austria allowed Italy to annex Venetia, which had been a kingdom of the Austrian Empire since the 1815 Congress of Vienna. In addition, French mobilization for the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–1871 made it necessary for Napoleon III to withdraw his troops from Rome and the Papal States. Without these two events, Italian unification would have been a more prolonged process.
Russia.
After Russia's victory over the Ottoman Empire in the Russo-Turkish War of 1877–78, Bismarck helped negotiate a settlement at the Congress of Berlin. The Treaty of Berlin revised the earlier Treaty of San Stefano, reducing the size of newly independent Bulgaria, a pro-Russian state at that time. Bismarck and other European leaders opposed the growth of Russian influence and tried to protect the integrity of the Ottoman Empire. See Eastern Question. As a result, Russo-German relations further suffered, with the Russian Chancellor Gorchakov denouncing Bismarck for compromising his nation's victory. The relationship was additionally strained due to Germany's protectionist trade policies. Some in the German military clamored for a preemptive war with Russia, but Bismarck said that preemptive war is like committing suicide for fear of death.
Triple Alliance.
The League of the Three Emperors having fallen apart, Bismarck negotiated the dual alliance with Austria-Hungary, in which each guaranteed the other against Russian attack. He also negotiated the Triple Alliance in 1882 with Austria-Hungary and Italy. This was a completely different alliance to the dual alliance. Italy and Austria-Hungary soon reached the Mediterranean Agreement with Britain. Attempts to reconcile Germany and Russia did not have lasting effect. The Three Emperors League was re-established in 1881, but quickly fell apart, the end of the Russian-Austrian-Prussian solidarity which had existed in various forms since 1813. Bismarck therefore negotiated the Reinsurance Treaty of 1887 with Russia, in order to prevent the Bismarckian nightmare of a Franco-Russian encirclement. Both powers promised to remain neutral towards one another unless Russia attacked Austria-Hungary. However, The reinsurance treaty failed to be renewed by Wilhelm II in 1890 after Bismarck's departure from office, thus creating a critical problem for Germany in the event of a war.
Colonies.
Bismarck had opposed colonial acquisitions, arguing that the burden of obtaining, maintaining and defending such possessions would outweigh any potential benefit. He felt that colonies did not pay for themselves, that the German bureaucratic system would not work well in the easygoing tropics, and that the diplomatic disputes colonies brought would distract Germany from its central interest, Europe itself. However, in 1883-84 he suddenly reversed himself and overnight built a colonial empire in Africa and the South Pacific. Historians have debated exactly why he made this sudden and short-lived move. He was aware that public opinion had started to demand colonies for reasons of German prestige. He also wanted to undercut the anti-colonial liberals who were sponsored by the Crown Prince, who might soon become Kaiser and remove Bismarck. The old Kaiser was 84 years old. Bismarck was influenced by Hamburg merchants and traders, his neighbors at Friedrichsruhe. The establishment of the German colonial empire proceeded smoothly, starting with German New Guinea in 1884. Other European nations, led by Britain and France, were acquiring colonies in a rapid fashion, see New Imperialism. Bismarck therefore joined in the scramble for Africa. Germany's new colonies included Togoland, now Togo and part of Ghana, German Cameroon, now Cameroon and part of Nigeria, German East Africa, now Rwanda, Burundi, and the mainland part of Tanzania, and German Southwest Africa, now Namibia. The Berlin Conference, 1884-85, established regulations for the acquisition of African colonies. In particular, it protected free trade in certain parts of the Congo Basin. Germany also acquired colonies in the Pacific, such as German New Guinea.
Avoiding war.
In February 1888, during a Bulgarian crisis, Bismarck addressed the Reichstag on the dangers of a European war. Bismarck also repeated his emphatic warning against any German military involvement in Balkan disputes. Bismarck had first made this famous comment to the Reichstag in December 1876, when the Balkan revolts against the Ottoman Empire threatened to extend to a war between Austria and Russia. A leading diplomatic historian of the era, William L. Langer sums up Bismarck's 2 decades as Chancellor. Langer concludes,
Social legislation.
Bismarck implemented the world's first welfare state in the 1880s. He worked closely with large industry and aimed to stimulate German economic growth by giving workers greater security. A secondary concern was trumping the socialists, who had no welfare proposals of their own and opposed Bismarck's. Bismarck especially listened to Hermann Wegener and Theodor Lochmann, advisers who persuaded him to give workers a corporate status in the legal and political structures of the new German state. In March 1884, Bismarck declared, Bismarck's idea was to implement welfare programs that were acceptable to conservatives without any socialistic aspects. He was dubious about laws protecting workers at the workplace, such as safe working conditions, limitation of work hours, and the regulation of women's and child labor. He believed that such regulation would force workers and employers to reduce work and production, and thus harm the economy. Bismarck opened debate on the subject in November 1881 in the Imperial Message to the Reichstag, using the term practical Christianity to describe his program. Bismarck's program centered squarely on insurance programs designed to increase productivity, and focus the political attentions of German workers on supporting the Junkers government. The program included sickness insurance, accident insurance, disability insurance, and a retirement pension, none of which were then in existence to any great degree. Based on Bismarck's message, the Reichstag filed 3 bills to deal with the concepts of accident and sickness insurance. The subjects of retirement pensions and disability insurance were placed on the back burner for the time being. The social legislation implemented by Bismarck in the 1880s played a key role in the sharp, rapid decline of German emigration to America. young men considering immigration looked at not only the gap between higher hourly direct wages in the United States and Germany but also the differential in indirect wages, social benefits, which favored staying in Germany. The young men went to German industrial cities, so that Bismarck's insurance system partly offset low wage rates in Germany and furthered the fall of the emigration rate.
Sickness Insurance Law of 1883.
The first bill that had success was the Sickness Insurance Bill, which was passed in 1883. Bismarck considered the program the least important and the least politically troublesome. The program was established to provide sickness insurance for German industrial laborers. The health service was established on a local basis, with the cost divided between employers and the employed. The employers contributed 1/3, while the workers contributed 2/3. The minimum payments for medical treatment and sick pay for up to 13 weeks were legally fixed. The individual local health bureaus were administered by a committee elected by the members of each bureau, and this move had the unintended effect of establishing a majority representation for the workers on account of their large financial contribution. This worked to the advantage of the Social Democrats who, through heavy worker membership, achieved their first small foothold in public administration.
Accident Insurance Law of 1884.
Bismarck's government had to submit 3 draft bills before they could get one passed by the Reichstag in 1884. Bismarck had originally proposed that the federal government pay a portion of the accident insurance contribution. Bismarck's motive was a demonstration of the willingness of the German government to lessen the hardship experienced by the German workers as a means of weaning them away from the various left-wing parties, most importantly the Social Democrats. The National Liberals took this program to be an expression of state socialism, which they were dead set against. The Centre Party was afraid of the expansion of federal power at the expense of states' rights. As a result, the only way the program could be passed at all was for the entire expense to be underwritten by the employers. To facilitate this, Bismarck arranged for the administration of this program to be placed in the hands of Der Arbeitsbund und den Beruflichen Corporationen, the organization of employers in occupational corporations. This organization established central and bureaucratic insurance offices on the federal, and in some cases the state level to perform the actual administration. The program kicked in to replace the sickness insurance program as of the 14th week. It paid for medical treatment and a pension of up to 2/3 of earned wages if the worker was fully disabled. This program was expanded in 1886 to include agricultural workers.
Old Age and Disability Insurance Law of 1889.
The Old Age Pension Program, an insurance equally financed by employers and workers, was designed to provide a pension annuity for workers who reached age 70 years. Unlike the accident insurance and sickness insurance programs, this program covered all categories of workers, industrial, agrarian, artisans and servants from the start. Also, unlike the other 2 programs, the principle that the national government should contribute a portion of the underwriting cost, with the other 2 portions prorated accordingly, was accepted without question. The disability insurance program was intended to be used by those permanently disabled. This time, the state or province supervised the programs directly.
Last years.
In 1888, the German Emperor, Wilhelm I, died leaving the throne to his son, Friedrich III. The new monarch was already suffering from an incurable throat cancer and died after reigning for only 99 days. He was succeeded by his son, Wilhelm II, who opposed Bismarck's careful foreign policy, preferring vigorous and rapid expansion to enlarge Germany's place in the sun. Bismarck was 16 years older than Friedrich. Before the latter became terminally ill, Bismarck did not expect he would live to see Wilhelm ascend to the throne, and thus had no strategy to deal with him. Conflicts between Wilhelm II and his chancellor soon poisoned their relationship. Perhaps on account of his prominent role in Wilhelm's upbringing, Bismarck believed that he could dominate the young Kaiser and showed little respect for his policies in the late 1880s. However, Wilhelm wanted to be his own master and was surrounded by sycophants telling him that Frederick the Great would not have been so great with a Bismarck at his side. Their final split occurred after Bismarck tried to implement far-reaching anti-socialist laws in early 1890. The cartel majority in the Reichstag, of the amalgamated Conservative Party and the National Liberal Party, was willing to make most of the laws permanent. But it was split about the law allowing the police the power to expel socialist agitators from their homes, a power used excessively at times against political opponents. The National Liberals refused to make this law permanent, while the Conservatives supported only the entirety of the bill and threatened to and eventually vetoed the entire bill in session because Bismarck would not agree to a modified bill. As the debate continued, Wilhelm became increasingly interested in social problems, especially the treatment of mine workers during their strike in 1889, and keeping with his active policy in government, routinely interrupted Bismarck in council to make clear his social policy. Bismarck sharply disagreed with Wilhelm's policy and worked to circumvent it. Even though Wilhelm supported the altered anti-socialist bill, Bismarck pushed for his support to veto the bill in its entirety. But when his arguments could not convince Wilhelm, Bismarck became excited and agitated until uncharacteristically blurting out his motive to see the bill fail, to have the socialists agitate until a violent clash occurred that could be used as a pretext to crush them. Wilhelm replied that he was not willing to open his reign with a bloody campaign against his own subjects. The next day, after realizing his blunder, Bismarck attempted to reach a compromise with Wilhelm by agreeing to his social policy towards industrial workers, and even suggested a European Council to discuss working conditions, presided over by the German Emperor. Despite this, a turn of events eventually led to his distancing from Wilhelm. Bismarck, feeling pressured and unappreciated by the Emperor and undermined by ambitious advisers, refused to sign a proclamation regarding the protection of workers along with Wilhelm, as was required by the German constitution, to protest Wilhelm's ever-increasing interference to Bismarck's previously unquestioned authority. Bismarck also worked behind the scenes to break the Continental Labour Council on which Wilhelm had set his heart. The final break came as Bismarck searched for a new parliamentary majority, with his cartel voted from power due to the anti-socialist bill fiasco. The remaining forces in the Reichstag were the Catholic Centre Party and the Conservative Party. Bismarck wished to form a new bloc with the Centre Party, and invited Ludwig Windthorst, the parliamentary leader, to discuss an alliance. This would be Bismarck's last political maneuver. Wilhelm was furious to hear about Windthorst's visit. In a parliamentary state, the head of government depends on the confidence of the parliamentary majority, and certainly has the right to form coalitions to ensure his policies are majority. However, in Germany, the Chancellor depended on the confidence of the Emperor alone, and Wilhelm believed that the Emperor had the right to be informed before his ministers' meeting. After a heated argument in Bismarck's office, Wilhelm, whom Bismarck had allowed to see a letter from Tsar Alexander III describing him as a badly brought-up boy, stormed out, after first ordering the rescinding of the Cabinet Order of 1851, which had forbidden Prussian cabinet ministers to report directly to the King of Prussia, requiring them instead to report via the Prime Minister. Bismarck, forced for the first time into a situation he could not use to his advantage, wrote a blistering letter of resignation, decrying Wilhelm's interference in foreign and domestic policy, which was published only after Bismarck's death. As it turned out, Bismarck became the first victim of his own creation, and when he realized that his dismissal was imminent. Bismarck resigned at Wilhelm II's insistence on March 18, 1890, at age 75, to be succeeded as Chancellor of Germany and Minister-President of Prussia by Leo von Caprivi. Bismarck was discarded, dropping the pilot in the words of the famous Punch cartoon, promoted to the rank of Colonel General with the dignity of Field Marshal, so called because the German army did not appoint full field marshals in peacetime, and given a new title, Duke of Lauenburg, which he joked would be useful when traveling incognito. He was soon elected as a national liberal to the Reichstag for Benigsen's old and supposedly safe Hamburg seat, but was embarrassed by being forced to a second ballot by a Social Democrat rival, and never actually took up his seat. He entered into restless, resentful retirement to his estates at Varzin, in today's Poland. Within 1 month after his wife died on November 27, 1894, he moved to Friedrichsruhe near Hamburg, waiting in vain to be petitioned for advice and counsel.
Last warning and prediction.
In December 1897, Wilhelm II visited Bismarck for the last time. Bismarck again warned the Kaiser about the dangers of improvising government policy based on the intrigues of courtiers and militarists. Bismarck's last warning was. Subsequently, Bismarck made this prediction.
Death.
Bismarck spent his final years composing his memoirs, Gedanken und Erinnerungen, or Thoughts and Memories, a work of literary genius but questionable accuracy, in which he increased the drama around every event and always presented himself favorably. He died in July 1898, at age 83, at Friedrichsruhe, where he is entombed in the Bismarck Mausoleum. He was succeeded as First von Bismarck-Schönhausen by Herbert. He continued his feud with Wilhelm II by attacking him in his memoirs and by publishing the text of the reinsurance treaty with Russia, a breach of national security for which any individual of lesser status would have been prosecuted. He managed one final attack on Wilhelm II by having his tombstone inscribed with the epitaph "Here lies a true servant of the Emperor Wilhelm I."
Legacy and memory.
Historians have reached a broad consensus on the content, function and importance of the image of Bismarck within Germany's political culture over the past 125 years. According to Steinberg, his achievements in 1862-71 were the greatest diplomatic and political achievement by any leader in the last 2 centuries. Bismarck's most important legacy is the unification of Germany. Germany had existed as a collection of hundreds of separate principalities and free cities since the formation of the Holy Roman Empire. Over the centuries, various rulers had tried to unify the German states without success until Bismarck. Largely as a result of Bismarck's efforts, the various German kingdoms were united into a single country. Following unification, Germany became one of the most powerful nations in Europe. Bismarck's astute, cautious, and pragmatic foreign policies allowed Germany to retain peacefully the powerful position into which he had brought it, maintaining amiable diplomacy with almost all European nations. France, the main exception, was devastated by Bismarck's wars and his harsh subsequent policies towards it. France became one of Germany's most bitter enemies in Europe. Austria, too, was weakened by the creation of a German empire, though to a much lesser extent than France. Bismarck believed that as long as Britain, Russia and Italy were assured of the peaceful nature of the German Empire, French belligerency could be contained. His diplomatic feats were undone, however, by Kaiser Wilhelm II, whose policies unified other European powers against Germany in time for World War I. Historians stress that Bismarck's peace-oriented, saturated continental diplomacy was increasingly unpopular, because it consciously reined in any expansionist drives. In dramatic contrast stands the ambition of Wilhelm II's Weltpolitik to secure the Reich's future through expansion, leading to World War I. Likewise, Bismarck's policy to deny the military a dominant voice in foreign political decision-making was overturned by 1914 as Germany became an armed state. Bismarck's psychology and personal traits have not been so favorably received by scholars. The American historian Jonathan Steinberg portrays a malign genius who was deeply vengeful, even towards his closest friends and family members. Evans says he was intimidating and unscrupulous, playing to others' frailties, not their strengths. British historians, including Evans, Taylor, Palmer and Crankshaw, see Bismarck as an ambivalent figure, undoubtedly a man of great skill but who left no lasting system in place to guide successors less skilled than himself. Being a committed monarchist himself, Bismarck allowed no effective constitutional check on the power of the emperor, thus placing a time bomb in the foundation of the Germany that he created. Observers at the time and ever since have commented on Bismarck's skill as a writer. As Henry Kissinger has noted, the man of blood and iron wrote prose of extraordinary directness and lucidity, comparable in distinctiveness to Churchill's use of the English language. During most of his nearly 30-year-long tenure, Bismarck held undisputed control over the government's policies. He was well supported by his friend Albrecht von Roon, the war minister, as well as the leader of the Prussian army Helmut von Moltke. Bismarck's diplomatic moves relied on a victorious Prussian military, and these two men gave Bismarck the victories he needed to convince the smaller German states to join Prussia. Bismarck took steps to silence or restrain political opposition, as evidenced by laws restricting the freedom of the press, and the anti-socialist laws. He waged a culture war, Kulturkampf, against the Catholic Church until he realized the conservatism of the Catholics made them natural allies against the socialists. His King Wilhelm I rarely challenged the Chancellor's decisions. On several occasions, Bismarck obtained his monarch's approval by threatening to resign. However, Wilhelm II intended to govern the country himself, making the ousting of Bismarck one of his first tasks as Kaiser. Bismarck's successors as Chancellor were much less influential, as power was concentrated in the Emperor's hands.
Memorials.
Immediately after he left office, citizens started to praise him and established funds to build monuments like the Bismarck Memorial or towers dedicated to him. Throughout Germany, the accolades were unending. Several buildings were named in his honor, portraits of him were commissioned from artists such as Franz von Lenbach and C.W. Orwell, and books about him became bestsellers. The first monument built in his honor was the one at Bad Kissingen, erected in 1877. Numerous statues and memorials dot the cities, towns, and countryside of Germany, including the famous Bismarck Memorial in Berlin and numerous Bismarck towers on 4 continents. The only memorial depicting him as a student at Göttingen University, together with a dog, possibly his Reichsschneiderers, and as a member of his Corps Hannover, was re-erected in 2006 at the Rudelsburg. The gleaming white 1906 Bismarck monument in the city of Hamburg, stands in the center of the St. Pauli district, and is the largest, and probably best known, memorial to Bismarck worldwide. The statues depicted him as massive, monolithic, rigid and unambiguous. The German Imperial Navy named 2 ships in his honor, the Kaiserliche Marine, and the Bismarck from the World War II era.
Bismarck myth.
Gerworth, 2007, shows that the Bismarck myth, built up predominantly during his years of retirement and even more stridently after his death, proved a powerful rhetorical and ideological tool. The myth made him out to be a dogmatic ideologue and ardent nationalist when, in fact, he was ideologically flexible. Gerworth argues that the constructed memory of Bismarck played a central role as an anti-democratic myth in the highly ideological battle over the past which raged between 1918 and 1933. This myth proved to be a weapon against the Weimar Republic, and exercised a destructive influence on the political culture of the first German democracy. Frankel, 2005, showed the Bismarck cult fostered and legitimized a new style of right-wing politics, and made possible the post-Bismarckian crisis of leadership, both real and perceived, that a German seeking the strongest possible leader and asking, what would Bismarck do? For example, Hamburg's memorial, unveiled in 1906, is considered one of the greatest expressions of Imperial Germany's Bismarck cult and an important development in the history of German memorial art. It was a product of the desire of Hamburg's patrician classes to defend their political privileges in the face of dramatic social change and attendant demands for political reform. To those who presided over its construction, the monument was also a means of asserting Hamburg's cultural aspirations and of shrugging off a reputation as a city hostile to the arts. The memorial was greeted with widespread disapproval among the working classes and did not prevent their increasing support for the Social Democrats.
Place names.
A number of localities around the world have been named in Bismarck's honor. They include Bismarck Archipelago, near the former German colony of New Guinea; Bismarck, Illinois; Bismarck, North Dakota, a city and state capital in the United States; Bismarck, Missouri, a city in Missouri; Bismarck Sea; Bismarck Strait, a channel in Antarctica; Bismarckburg, Kasanga, Tanzania.
Titles and styles from birth to death.
1st April 1815 to 1865, Junker Otto von Bismarck, 1865 to 1871, Highborn Count Otto of Bismarck-Schönhausen, 1871 to 1890, His Serene Highness the Prince of Bismarck, 1890–July 30, 1898, His Serene Highness the Prince of Bismarck, Duke of Lauenburg. Bismarck was created Graf von Bismarck-Schönhausen, Count of Bismarck-Schönhausen in 1865. This comital title is borne by all his descendants in the male line. In 1871, he was further created Fürst von Bismarck, Prince of Bismarck, and accorded the style of Durchlaucht, equivalent to Serene Highness. This princely title descended only to his eldest male heirs.
Duke of Lauenburg.
In 1890, Bismarck was created further Herzog von Lauenburg, Duke of Lauenburg. The duchy was one of the territories which Prussia seized from the Danish king in 1864. It was Bismarck's ambition to be assimilated into the mediatized houses of Germany. He attempted to persuade Kaiser Wilhelm I that he should be endowed with a sovereign duchy of Lauenburg, in reward for his services to the imperial family and the German Empire. This was on the understanding that Bismarck would immediately restore the duchy to Prussia. All that he wanted was the privilege of a mediatized family for himself and his descendants. This novel idea was turned down by the conservative emperor, who thought that he had already given the chancellor enough rewards. There is reason to believe that he informed Wilhelm II of his wishes. After being forced by the sovereign to resign, he received the purely honorific title of Duke of Lauenburg, without the duchy itself and the sovereignty that would have transformed his family into a mediatized house. Bismarck regarded it as a mockery of his ambition, and he considered nothing more cruel than this action of the emperor. On Bismarck's death in 1898, his dukedom, held only for his own lifetime, was extinguished and the princely title passed to his eldest son,